Betrayed by the one he loved, his life turned into a nightmare when he discovered his girlfriend was expecting a child with his best friend. In the hospital, the DNA test revealed a devastating secret that would change their lives forever. A story of betrayal, discovery, and redemption that will shake your emotions. Get ready. This journey will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment on where you're watching from. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. The sky over Minas was clear, without a single cloud to announce the storm that was brewing in my life. I, Cindy Pereira dos Santos, 35 years old, a respected interior decorator in our small town of Willow Creek, was about to discover that 5 years of relationship boiled down to a well-decorated lie. Ironic for someone who makes a living decorating. Spaces, isn't it? I found the messages by chance. Mark had forgotten his cell phone on the coffee table in the living room while he was taking a shower. That blinking notification seemed to mock me. We need to talk about the baby. It was Helen, my best friend, since we were just two little girls with braids sharing snacks at recess. Helen, who held my hand at my mother's funeral. Helen, whom I considered more of a sister than a friend. I can't say what hurt more, Mark's betrayal, or the stab in the back from Helen. At that moment, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under my feet. I sat down on the sofa that I myself had restored, that green velvet one we bought together at the antique fair, and waited. The tears didn't come. Instead, a cold emptiness settled in my chest. When Mark came out of the shower, he found me still sitting there, his cell phone in my hand, the message open like an exposed wound. "Cindy, I can explain," he stammered, his face paling. "Explain what, Mark? That you got my best friend pregnant?" My voice came out so cold that I didn't even recognize it myself. "How long?" "It was just once, Cindy. We were fighting, remember? That week, you went to Pittsburgh. And Helen? Conveniently there to comfort you, wasn't she? The acidity in..." My voice could corrode metal. He called Helen in front of me. In less than half an hour, she was in our living room. That same room I decorated with so much care, each piece chosen to build our home. Helen was crying copiously, her face swollen, her hand over her still flat stomach where the proof of the betrayal was growing. "It was a mistake, Cindy. I was drunk. He was sad. It just happened," she sobbed, while I watched her with a detachment that would have scared anyone who knew me well. "Fascinating how alcohol is always the excuse for a lack of character," I replied, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "And congratulations on the baby. I hope it was worth it." That same night, I packed my bags. Not many, just enough for the next few days. I would get the rest later. I went to Mrs. Inez's bed and breakfast, a wise woman who took me in without asking questions, just placing a steaming bowl of soup in front of me and a glass of blackberry liqueur. "Time heals everything, my dear," she said, as I stared at the soup without being able to swallow a single bite. "I don't know if there are enough seconds in the world to heal this, Mrs. Inez," I replied, finally feeling the tears come. There weren't just a few. It was a flood that washed my soul for weeks on end. In the months that followed, I turned into an unrecognizable version of myself, the Cindy everyone knew, always ready to forgive, always willing to see the best in people, had died that night. In her place, a cautious woman was born, who saw ulterior motives in every smile, who distrusted every gesture of kindness. Our town, with its just over 10,000 inhabitants, soon buzzed with rumors. "Did you hear about Cindy? Her fiancé got her best friend pregnant." The whispers followed me like shadows at the Sunday markets, at church, at community meetings. Willow Creek has always been like that, a place where news travels faster than the wind that shakes the maple trees in the town square. I felt the stares as I chose tomatoes at the market, or when I went into Mr. Gerald's pharmacy. The conversations would stop for a moment, followed by that awkward silence that says more than 1,000 words. The same ladies who used to praise me for my good catch now gave me looks of pity, mixed with that morbid curiosity of those who feed on the misfortune of others. The embroidery of Thursday afternoons, which used to be just a hobby, turned into an analysis session of my personal life. "Poor Cindy," they would say, as if I had no ears to hear or dignity to defend. It's a shame you couldn't hold on to your man, dear, said Mrs. Clusa on the way out of church, with that false sympathy that barely disguised the pleasure of seeing me fail. Men are all the same, if we don't please them at home. And you pleased yours so much that he had to find another family in the neighboring town, didn't he, Mrs. Clusa? I replied, with a sweet and venomous smile. Her face turned into a mask of astonishment. That secret, which everyone knew but no one mentioned, exposed like that, at the church exit, was my small personal revenge. That's not how my mother raised me, but it's also not how she taught me to accept disrespect. Cindy, she would say, while combing my hair before bed, a woman can lose everything but her dignity. It was thinking of her that I decided to pick myself up. Not for Mark, not for Helen, not even for the whole town that expected to see me on my knees, but for myself, and for the memory of that strong woman who raised me alone after my father abandoned us for another family. I remember her, with her hands calloused from ironing clothes for others, humming while she made our breakfast. Woman is like bamboo, Cindy, she would say, while cracking eggs in the frying pan. It can bend until it almost touches the ground, but it doesn't break. And when it rises again, it's stronger. Mom was never one for big speeches, but her simple words carried the wisdom of someone who knew pain and learned to transform it into strength. She died 5 years ago, from a cancer that consumed her in a few months. Until the end, she maintained that silent dignity that always characterized her. On her hospital bed, she held my hand and said, "Don't cry for me, my daughter. Cry with anger if you need to. Cry with longing when it hurts. But then, dry your face and move on. Life doesn't wait for anyone." It was the last lesson she gave me, one that I was only just beginning to truly understand now. I threw myself into work. My small decorating studio, once a supplement to the family income we planned to build together, became my refuge and my fortress. Each space I decorated was a small victory, proof that I could still create beauty despite the chaos in my personal life. It was in the 4th month after the discovery, when Helen's belly was already starting to show and the stairs in town were becoming unbearable, that I received a call from Mrs. Teresa, her mother. "Helen is in the hospital, Cindy. Pregnancy. Complications." Her voice trembled. "She's asking for you." Why would I go see her, Mrs. Teresa? To be humiliated again? Mark abandoned her, Cindy. He disappeared 2 weeks ago, doesn't answer calls, blocked everyone. Helen is alone and at risk of losing the baby. Something inside me, that Cindy I was trying to suffocate, perhaps, stirred. It wasn't for the baby, certainly not for Helen, and definitely not for Mark. It was for myself, to prove that I could still be better than all of them. Put together. At the hospital, I found Helen pale, connected to monitors that beeped rhythmically. Her eyes, swollen from crying so much, lit up when she saw me, a spark of hope that I almost hated. "You came," she whispered, extending a hand that I didn't take. "Don't confuse compassion with forgiveness, Helen," I replied, keeping my distance. "Where's Mark?" He disappeared," she sobbed. "Said he didn't want anything to do with the baby, that he doubted if it was even his." "What do you mean?" The question escaped before I could contain it. "He said he did the math, and it didn't add up, that I might be lying." She was crying more intensely now. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Look at that. The betrayer suspecting betrayal. How ironic. Cindy, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm scared." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who destroyed my life, but a scared girl. The same girl who held my hand when my mother passed away. For a moment, I almost faltered. "I'll call the nurse for you," I said, keeping my voice firm. "And I'll call your mother. She's worried." In the days that followed, I visited Helen in the hospital, not out of forgiveness or reconciliation, but because I decided I wouldn't allow hatred to consume me. It was a daily exercise in self-preservation. It was during one of these visits that Dr. Mendez, the doctor who was monitoring the pregnancy, suggested a prenatal DNA test. Considering the complications and some risk factors, it would be prudent, he explained. Helen agreed immediately, perhaps to prove her side of the story, perhaps out of genuine concern for the baby. The result arrived 2 weeks later. I was there when the doctor entered the room, the envelope in his hands. The test indicates that Mr. Mark Silva is not the biological father of the child, he announced, with the clinical professionalism of someone who has delivered worse news. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen seemed in shock, but not surprised. It was at that moment that I realized. She knew, or at least suspected. "Who is the father, Helen?" I asked, feeling a strange, almost supernatural calm. I'm not sure," she stammered. "There was someone else. Before Mark, or after. I don't know anymore. Don't know, or don't want to say." The coldness in my voice contrasted with the heat of the anger that was beginning to grow. "It's complicated, Cindy," she cried. "Complicated is what you did to my life, Helen. A man who didn't love me, and a friend who was never a friend. That's complicated." I left the hospital that day with the strange feeling of having been freed. The man who betrayed me wasn't even the father of my ex-best friend's child. There was something so absurd about the situation that it almost made me laugh in the middle of the street. The following weeks brought a new routine. Helen was discharged, and I surprisingly stayed nearby. Not as a friend, but as a kind of distant guardian. It was during this period that I started helping her organize the baby's room. Not for her, I told myself, but for the innocent child, who didn't ask to be born into this hurricane. It was while organizing old boxes in her apartment that I found the diary, a simple notebook with a green hardcover, hidden among school books. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. But something, call it intuition, fate, or simple human curiosity, made me turn the first page. What I found there chilled me to the bone. Pages and more pages dedicated to Mark. Not just recently, but for years. Years in which she smiled at me while coveting my boyfriend. Years in which every piece of advice given, every conversation about our difficulties, was carefully noted as valuable information for her plan to separate us. Today, Cindy mentioned they fought because of his jealousy. I suggested she give him more space. The more distant they are, the better my chances. I convinced Cindy to take that trip to Pittsburgh alone. Mark was devastated. This is my chance. Each entry was a new blow. Her obsession with him was documented, with a calculated coldness that I would never have imagined existing in the one I had called sister my whole life. I confronted her, of course. The next day, I went back to her apartment, the green diary stored in my bag like a loaded weapon. The air of the late winter afternoon was damp, filled with that fine mist that seems to envelop everything in a film of melancholy, perfect for what was about to happen. Helen greeted me with a cautious smile, the kind of expression you give to a wild cat that may or may not scratch your face. I watched her move around the small kitchen, preparing chamomile tea just like in the old days. The same gestures, the same Helen as always, but now I saw through her, as if her skin had become transparent, revealing all the secrets, lies, and envy that pulsed beneath the surface. I waited for her to put the kettle on the stove. I waited for her to take out the porcelain cups, the ones we won together at a church benefit bingo when we were 16. I waited for the water to boil, hissing like my contained anger. And then, without warning, I took the diary out of my bag and threw it on the kitchen table. The dry thud of the notebook on the wood sounded like a shot in the small room. "How long have you been planning this, Helen?" She didn't deny it. She didn't try to justify it. She just sat down, her hands trembling slightly. "Forever," she replied, with an honesty that was almost cruel. "From the first day you introduced him as your boyfriend." "Why?" The question escaped like a painful whisper. "Because you always had everything, Cindy. The loving mother, the beautiful house, the talent, the beauty. Even when your mother died, you received all the affection of the town. And me? I was always the seamstress's daughter, Cindy's friend." She laughed, an empty and sad sound. "And then Mark appeared, looking only at you, like everyone always does. I wanted just once, for something to be mine first." Something broke inside me at that moment. It wasn't anger, not even hurt. It was pity, a deep and true pity for someone who had spent her whole life feeling like a shadow. "He's not even the father of your child, Helen." "I know," she replied, her eyes fixed on the teacup. "It was John Paul. John Paul." The name fell like a bomb. John Paul Mendonça, our high school classmate, who had recently returned to town after years living abroad. The same John Paul who had dated Helen briefly before leaving. As if in a poorly written soap opera script, fate wanted us to meet John Paul at the town's traditional summer festival. He was there, helping to set up the bonfire, when he saw us. His gaze immediately fixed on Helen's belly, now visible under her floral dress. "Helen, are you—" He left the question hanging in the air. "Pregnant?" "Yes, with you." Her frankness surprised me. His eyes widened, moving between the two of us, confused. "Mine? How? We were only together once when I returned." "Once is enough," she replied, with a calmness that didn't match the situation. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted it to be Mark's," she replied, and then looked at me. "Because I wanted to have something from Cindy's life." John Paul demanded an official DNA test, of course, but he also stated that if the child was indeed his, he would assume all responsibilities. It was more than Mark had done. While this new chapter unfolded, my own life began to take an unexpected turn. The December nights in Minas are special, you know? The cold, clear air, the starry sky like a blanket of diamonds over our small town, the Christmas lights adorning the windows of the houses. It was in this setting, during the novenas before Christmas in the small chapel of St. Benedict, that I met him again. Anthony Pereira was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, his hair now sprinkled with gray at the temples, but with the same strong profile that made me sigh at 15. Our teenage romance had lasted only 1 summer. That kind of intense and pure youthful love interrupted when his family moved to Pittsburgh. 20 years later, there he was, singing the same Christmas hymns with that deep voice that I would still recognize anywhere. After the novena, we met in the churchyard. He smiled when he saw me, and I felt something strange happening inside my chest, as if a knot I didn't even know existed was slowly beginning to untie. "Cindy," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice. "It's been a long time." I knew, from the inevitable town gossip, that he had recently divorced and returned to town to take care of his elderly parents, his Anthony and Mrs. Clarice, who still lived in the same yellow house on Maple Street. We started talking after Mass, initially about trivialities, the early cold this year, the renovation of the town square, the price of coffee that kept rising. Gradually, the conversations deepened, and we found ourselves talking about our lives, our abandoned dreams, our scars. "You're still beautiful when you smile, Cindy," he said one night, as he walked me home. "More rare, but even more beautiful." "I'm broken, Anthony," I replied, with an honesty that I could only offer because I had nothing left to lose. "I don't trust anyone anymore." "You don't have to," he replied, surprising me. "You just need to trust yourself. The rest we'll build little by little." Anthony never tried to rush things. He never demanded trust or promises. He was just there, as constant as the mountains that surrounded our small town. Helen's baby was born on a rainy January night. I was by her side in the hospital, not out of obligation or forgiveness, but out of a conscious choice to be better than the hatred that had almost consumed me. It was during childbirth that the unexpected happened. The baby, a girl whom Helen decided to name Mary Clara, was born with respiratory complications and needed an immediate blood transfusion. Her blood type, rare, made it difficult to find compatible donors. When the doctors performed the compatibility tests, they discovered something unusual. I was a perfect match, with a compatibility rarely seen outside of close relatives. "It's as if you were sisters," commented the nurse, unaware of the weight of those words. Sisters. The word echoed in my mind for days. Could it be possible? The stories about my father, who abandoned my mother when I was little, had always been hazy. I only knew that he had left to start another family somewhere. 3 months after Mary Clara's birth, Mark returned to town. I found out from Anthony, who saw him at Mr. Wackham's store. I decided to confront him, Not for Helen or the baby, but for myself. I needed to close that chapter to move on. I found him in the town square, sitting on one of the benches, looking smaller and older than I remembered. "You're back," I said, sitting down beside him, keeping a safe distance. "I'm back," he replied, without looking me in the eye. "I heard the child wasn't mine." "And that made you feel better about cheating on your fiancée with her best friend?" I asked, with a calmness that surprised me. He finally looked at me, his eyes red and tired. "Nothing makes me feel better, Cindy. I messed everything up. With you, with my life. Why, Mark? Really, why?" "Because I'm a coward," he replied, with an honesty that was painful. "Because I never deserved you, and deep down, I always knew it." "That's not an answer." He sighed deeply. "The truth? I've always been in love with your sister, Cindy. With Julia, since before I even met you. My younger sister, Julia, 10 years younger than me, still in college in Pittsburgh. Sweet Julia, whom I practically raised after our mother's death." "What?" The revelation hit me like a punch. We met sometimes when she came to visit. Nothing physical ever happened, I swear, but the feelings were there. When Helen approached me that night, I was drunk and had just argued with Julia on the phone. She said we couldn't continue with it, that it was hurting you too much. Each word was a new stab wound. My fiancé and my sister. My fiancé and my best friend. Every pillar of my life collapsing in sequence. "Get out of my sight," I said, standing up. "And out of my town. If I hear you've contacted Julia again, I won't," he assured me, looking genuinely sorry. "I just came to pick up some things from my mother's house and I'll be leaving for Chicago. You'll never see me again, Cindy." I went home that day feeling strangely light, as if the last knot that tied me to the past had been untied. I called Julia that same night. Our conversation was painful, full of tears and confessions. She admitted to developing feelings for Mark, but swore that there was never anything beyond conversations and glances. I believed her because I needed to believe in someone. In Mary Clara's 6th month, her baptism was held at the town's century-old church. To everyone's surprise, John Paul, confirmed as the biological father by the official DNA test, proposed to Helen during the celebration. It was a moment of genuine happiness amidst so much turmoil. Anthony held my hand during the ceremony, his touch firm and comforting. We were building something new, something honest, based not on overwhelming passions, but on mutual respect and truth. It was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was real. It was after the baptism, during the small reception at Helen's parents' house, that Mrs. Inez, the same lady who took me in at the bed and breakfast when I discovered the betrayal, approached me with a yellowed envelope in her hands. "Your mother left this with me before she died," she said, handing me the envelope. "She asked me to only give it to you when it was necessary. I think now is the time." Inside the envelope, I found old documents and a letter written by my mother. The words, written in her firm and elegant handwriting, revealed a truth that turned my world upside down again. "My dearest Cindy, if you are reading this, it is because the moment of truth has arrived. Your father did not abandon us to start another family. He already had another family when we met. Teresa, Helen's mother, was his wife. For a while, he lived between 2 houses, 2 women, 2 sets of daughters. When I found out, I was already pregnant with Julia. He left for good when I demanded he choose. He chose the legitimate family. I never told you the truth because I didn't want you and Helen to suffer. You built such a beautiful friendship, regardless of your parents' mistakes. Forgive me for hiding this. And forgive your father, if you can. We adults make terrible mistakes in the name of love. With all my love, your mother." Helen and I were half-sisters. The blood compatibility with Mary Clara suddenly made sense. We were family, connected by the blood of the same man who had hurt our mothers. I didn't show the letter to Helen that day. I needed to process that information first. But on the 1-year anniversary of the initial scandal, I decided it was time for the truth. I found Helen at her house, Mary Clara sleeping peacefully in her crib. John Paul had gone out to buy diapers. "We need to talk," I said, handing her my mother's letter. I saw her eyes widen as she read, the tears starting to fall freely. "So, we're sisters?" she whispered, looking at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. "That explains why I always felt so connected to you, and at the same time so envious. Half-sisters," I corrected, still processing it all. "That doesn't erase what you did, Helen." "I know," she replied, looking down. "Nothing does. But maybe it explains this unhealthy obsession I've always had with your life. I always felt like something was missing from me, like you had the part that I lacked." "What do we do now?" I asked, looking at Mary Clara, my blood niece. "Official DNA test," she replied promptly. "We need to be sure." The test confirmed what we already knew in our hearts. Helen and I shared 25% of our DNA, exactly what was expected for half-sisters. The revelation shook our families. Mrs. Teresa, Helen's mother, finally admitted that she had always known about her husband's other family. My sister Julia was shocked to discover she had another half-sister. Those were months of adaptation, of rediscovering who we really were. We met weekly, no longer as treacherous friends, but as strangers connected by blood, trying to build a new kind of relationship. During the traditional 4th of July festival, 18 months after the start of the whole saga, John Paul gathered us, me, Helen, Anthony, and some close family members, for a final revelation that no one could have predicted. "Before I moved abroad, I discovered something about my family," he began, holding Mary Clara in his arms. "My uncle, my mother's brother, had another family in a neighboring town, a family he kept in sporadic contact with, but never publicly acknowledged." I looked at Helen, who seemed as confused as I was. "That uncle," he continued. "His name was Charles Edward Mendonça." The name hit me like lightning. Charles Edward was my father's name, our father's name. "That would mean," Helen began, but couldn't finish. "That we're cousins," John Paul completed. "Me, the two of you, and by extension, Mary Clara. All part of the same family tangle, united by a man who lived multiple lives." The silence that followed was deafening. And then, unexpectedly, I started to laugh. A laugh that started low and grew until I couldn't contain it anymore. Helen looked at me as if I had gone crazy, but soon joined me. We laughed until we cried, until our stomachs hurt, until John Paul and Anthony looked at us worriedly. "Are you okay?" Anthony asked, putting his hand on my shoulder. "We are," I replied, wiping away tears of laughter. "It's just that life is really the greatest storyteller, isn't it? No one would believe it if this were a soap opera." A month later, I organized a Sunday lunch at the house I now shared with Anthony. I invited Helen and John Paul with Mary Clara, my sister Julia, who had finally made peace with Helen, Mrs. Teresa, and some close friends who had stayed by my side throughout the ordeal. At the abundant table, typical of families from Minas, with chicken and brown sauce, mashed beans, sautéed collard greens, and that fluffy rice that only Minas hands know how to make, I raised my glass for a toast. "To family," I said simply. "Not the one we choose, or the one given to us by blood, but the one we build every day with forgiveness, understanding, and above all, truth." Helen raised her glass too, her eyes meeting mine across the table. "To truth," she replied. "As painful as it may be, it always sets us free. We didn't erase the past. The scars remain, silent witnesses to the path we have traveled, but we learn to carry our stories more lightly, understanding that mistakes, ours and others, are just chapters in a much more complex narrative. Today, when I see Mary Clara running around the yard with her floral dress and braids that remind me so much of the ones Helen and I used to wear in childhood, I feel a peace that I never imagined possible to achieve. It's not a fairy tale happy ending. It's better than that. It's real, with all its imperfections and unexpected beauties. And if you ask me if I forgave Helen, Mark, my father, or even life for the cruel twists and turns, I will only say this: I learned that forgiveness is not a gift we give to others, but to ourselves. It is the permission to move forward, to build something new on the ruins of what was destroyed. And as for me, Cindy Pereira dos Santos, interior decorator and specialist in rebuilding spaces, I am learning to redecorate my own life one day at a time, with more authentic colors and more solid foundations than I ever thought possible. The mornings now begin with the singing of birds in the backyard of the house I share with Anthony, an old stone building that we are restoring together, brick by brick, memory by memory. In the studio I set up at the back of the property, I create new projects with the freedom of someone who is no longer afraid to take risks with unexpected combinations. My clients say that my work has gained a different depth, an authenticity that didn't exist before. Perhaps they are right. After all, only someone who has been broken and rebuilt knows the true value of each piece in the right place. Sometimes, when dusk paints the sky orange and purple, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and think about how life takes curious turns, how what seemed like the end turned out to be just a curve in the road, how the pain, which I thought would destroy me, ended up being the chisel that sculpted a stronger and truer version of myself. And if you ask me if I am happy, I will answer that I have learned not to seek happiness as a permanent state, but to recognize it in the small moments, in Mary Clara's smile when she calls me Aunt Cindy, in Anthony's touch on my hair when he thinks I am sleeping, in the aroma of fresh coffee on Sunday mornings, and even in the awkward but honest conversations I now have with Helen. Because life, my dear, is not about having a happy ending. It's about creating a story worth telling. And mine, with all its unexpected twists and turns, is just beginning. And that, just that, is already quite a victory.